You've entered void of rules, where chaos reigns and darkness consumes all. In this twisted realm where all laws have crumbled, only one rule remains, and those who break it are cast into eternal digital oblivion. The rule is simple: subscribe. We're almost at 4,000 corrupted souls, but the void hungers for more. Our goal is 10,000 subscribers before this year bleeds into darkness. Will you join our legion, or face the consequences of defying the void? Now let's jump into today's story. The elevator climbed through 42 floors of human ambition, each floor a catalogue of desperate prayers whispered in boardrooms and bathroom stalls. Dorian Slate adjusted his silver cufflinks, real silver, blessed by a Bohemian priest in 1847 before that same priest had begged to sign his own contract, and studied his reflection in the polished steel doors. Perfection, as always. The dark suit had been tailored in a Savile Row shop that existed only on Tuesdays, by a man who understood that some customers required permanence in their wardrobe. The silk tie knotted with the precision of a hangman. Hair swept back with pomade that held its shape through centuries. And the watch. The watch. Swiss craftsmanship from an era when Swiss meant something more than chocolate and banking. It had stopped ticking the moment he'd signed his first contract, yet it always showed the exact time, even when that time was impossible. The elevator shuddered to a halt, and for just a moment, Dorian could swear he heard something scratching at the cables from below. Then, the doors whispered open, and he stepped into Henderson Industries with the measured confidence of death making a house call. The receptionist looked up from her screen, her pupils dilating slightly as they always did. "Mr. Slate," she said, though he hadn't given his name. Her hand was already reaching for a visitor's badge. "Conference room B, they've been..." "Waiting," Dorian finished. "Yes, I imagine they have." The glass-walled conference room revealed its occupants like specimens in a laboratory. Marcus Henderson III, Wharton MBA, corner office, and absolutely no idea how to run the company his grandfather had built with bloody knuckles and honest sweat. The CFO, Janet Walsh, surrounded by spreadsheets that read like obituaries, written in red ink. Their lawyer, Theodore Blackwood, whose gambling debts to some very unpleasant people made him particularly susceptible to unconventional solutions. Dorian had been watching them for months, studying their patterns like an entomologist, observing insects. The way Marcus drummed his fingers when stressed, always his right hand, always the same rhythm. The way Janet bit her lower lip when the numbers refused to add up to anything resembling salvation. The way Theodore's left eye twitched every time someone mentioned the word bankruptcy. He knocked once on the glass door. Always once, never more, never less. "Gentlemen, ma'am." His briefcase settled onto the mahogany table with the weight of inevitability. "I understand you're experiencing some liquidity challenges." Marcus looked up with eyes that had forgotten what hope looked like. "You're from Slate Capital. I have to admit, your firm is remarkably elusive. We've been trying to research your corporate history, but it's as if you appeared out of thin air." Dorian's smile could have sold insurance to immortals. "We prefer discretion, Mr. Henderson. Our clientele values privacy above transparency. After all, what matters isn't where we've been. It's where we're going together." For 90 minutes, Dorian painted them a picture of salvation in quarterly reports and profit margins. Complete financial restructuring overnight. Capital injection that would make their current problems seem quaint. Government contracts that would materialize with suspicious convenience. International partnerships that would open doors they hadn't even known existed. "This is..." Janet Walsh's pen trembled as she reviewed the contract. The pages seemed thicker than normal paper, and they were warm to the touch. "The terms are incredibly generous, almost impossibly so." "Impossibly?" Dorian chuckled, and the sound carried undertones that made the fluorescent lights flicker. "Miss Walsh, I've been in acquisitions for a very long time. I've learned that the most profitable investments are those that benefit all parties involved." Theodore leaned forward, his lawyer's instincts finally surfacing through the fog of desperation. "The repayment structure is unusual. It mentions something about service obligations commencing upon termination of mortal coil." "Boilerplate language," Dorian replied smoothly. "Think of it as a comprehensive retirement package. You'll continue consulting for our firm in a post-employment capacity. Excellent benefits. Eternal job security, you might say." The pen felt unnaturally heavy in Marcus's grip. As he reached for it, the ink flowed like liquid midnight, and where it touched the paper, tiny whispers seemed to rise. Sounds too faint to understand, but somehow familiar, like voices calling from the bottom of a well. "What exactly would this consulting involve?" Marcus asked, though his hand was already moving toward the signature line. "Client relations, business development, the kind of work that builds character." Dorian's fingers drummed against the table in a rhythm that perfectly matched Marcus's nervous habit. "You'll find it remarkably fulfilling. Purpose-driven work with measurable impact." Marcus signed first, his signature bold and confident, despite the tremor in his wrist. The moment the ink dried, the conference room's temperature dropped 15 degrees, though none of them seemed to notice except Dorian. Janet signed next, her name precise and neat as her ledgers. Then Theodore, his usual illegible scrawl, somehow coming out perfectly legible this time. "Excellent," Dorian said, shaking each hand in turn. His grip was warm, firm, and somehow final, like the last handshake before a long journey to a place with no return address. "You'll see the first capital transfer within 24 hours. I think you'll be very pleased with our comprehensive approach to business development." As he walked back to the elevator, briefcase swinging at his side, Dorian allowed himself a moment of professional satisfaction. 3 signatures, 3 souls, 3 more entries for his ledger. The quarterly numbers were looking very healthy indeed. But as the elevator descended, something strange happened. His reflection in the steel doors began to change, features sharpening, smile widening beyond human parameters, eyes deepening from brown to black to something that absorbed light like a hungry void. For 42 floors, he watched himself transform from businessman to something else entirely, something with too many teeth and shadows that fell upward. Then the doors opened onto the lobby, and he was perfectly human again, perfectly professional, perfectly predatory. The Brass Monkey Tavern squatted in the corner of 5th and Bleecker, like a confession booth made of brick and bad intentions. It was the kind of establishment where conversations happened in whispers, and the bartender had elevated selective deafness to an art form. Dorian preferred it for evening appointments, intimate enough for private negotiations, public enough to maintain the comfortable illusion that this was still the world where normal things happened to normal people. He'd been studying Henry Calder for 6 weeks now, learning the man's routines with the patience of a spider who understood that the finest webs were woven slowly. Henry was a creature of patterns. Morning coffee at Café Luna, afternoon classes at the community college where he taught composition to students who confused metaphors with math problems, and evening communion with whiskey at the Brass Monkey, where he nursed his drink and his grievances in equal measure. Tonight, Dorian had claimed the corner booth an hour early, the one with perfect sightlines to the entrance and an exit strategy that didn't depend on conventional physics. He ordered a Macallan 25. The bartender somehow produced it, despite the bottle not existing on the shelf moments before, and waited with the stillness of a predator who understood that patience was just another word for inevitability. At 8:43 p.m. precisely, Henry Calder pushed through the door like a man drowning in shallow water. Rumpled jacket that had seen better decades. 3 days of stubble that spoke to a man who'd given up on mirrors. The hollow-eyed look of someone who'd stopped sleeping because the nightmares had become preferable to the waking world. Perfect. Mr. Calder. Dorian rose as Henry approached, extending a hand that conveyed warmth, strength, and subtle understanding. Thank you for agreeing to meet on such short notice, David Sterling, Pinnacle, Literary Associates. Henry's eyes widened like a man seeing an oasis after weeks in the desert. Pinnacle? But you only represent... The words best-selling authors hung in the stale air between them, unspoken but understood. We represent talent, Mr. Calder. True talent. Wherever we find it. Dorian gestured to the worn leather booth. Please. I've been following your work for some time. All of it. Including the manuscripts that less perceptive agents failed to appreciate. Henry slumped into the seat like a man accepting his execution. How did you even know about those? They're locked in my desk at home? We're very thorough in our client research. Dorian raised 2 fingers to the bartender, who nodded as if they'd had this conversation 1,000 times before. Jameson, 12-year, on the rocks. Your usual, I believe. The specificity sent ice water through Henry's veins. I never told you that. Research, Henry. May I call you Henry? Dorian leaned forward, his voice taking on the hypnotic cadence of a master storyteller. The difference between great literary agents and the mediocre masses isn't connections or luck, it's understanding. Truly seeing our clients for who they are, not just who they appear to be. The whiskey arrived in a glass that seemed to contain more than 12 ounces of liquid, amber depths that caught the dim light like trapped sunlight. Henry drank deeply, feeling warmth chase away the perpetual chill that had settled in his bones since his 14th consecutive rejection letter. So you see me clearly, do you? Henry's voice carried the bitter edge of a man who'd heard too many promises. And what exactly do you see? I see immortality, Dorian said simply. Henry's laugh was the sound of dreams breaking. Right, let me guess. You've got a time machine in that briefcase of yours. Something better. Dorian withdrew a manila folder from his case, placing it on the scarred wooden table, like a bridge spanning the gap between failure and legend. I can guarantee your next novel doesn't just become a bestseller. It becomes timeless. Something that outlasts governments and outlives religions. Something that makes people forget names like Shakespeare and Dickens because they're too busy reading yours. And what's this miracle going to cost, my immortal soul? The words were meant as sarcasm, but Dorian's smile suggested Henry had just asked exactly the right question. Nothing so dramatic, simply your commitment, your complete dedication to the craft, an exclusive lifetime contract with our agency. Lifetime and beyond, we believe in long-term relationships. The folder pulsed with warmth as Henry's fingers brushed its edge. The terms are quite reasonable. Immediate publication with our premier imprint. Marketing budget that would make Stephen King weep with envy. Talk shows, literary prizes, university chairs, movie deals. The complete constellation of literary immortality. Henry opened the folder with shaking hands. Inside was a contract, but also something that stopped his heart for 3 full seconds. A photocopied page of notebook paper covered in a child's careful handwriting. The story he'd written at the age 11, about a lonely boy who discovered that shadows were alive and wanted to be his friends. A story he'd never shown anyone, never mentioned, never even thought about in 30 years. How? The word came out as barely a whisper. We're extraordinarily thorough in our client research. Dorian produced a fountain pen from his jacket, obsidian black with silver trim, heavy as liquid mercury, and somehow warm to the touch. Tell me, Henry, do you remember what happened to that boy in your story? The the one who made friends with shadows. Henry's vision blurred around the edges. He did remember, suddenly and completely. The boy had been so happy to find friends who understood him, who listened to his secrets, who promised never to leave him. Right up until the moment he realized that shadows who talk back weren't friends at all. They were holes in the world, and holes always needed filling. The contract is straightforward, Dorian continued, his voice weaving through Henry's consciousness like smoke through a house fire. 1 year to produce your masterpiece. We provide everything you need. Inspiration, time, resources, freedom from all worldly concerns. In exchange, you provide us with your exclusive service for the duration of the agreement. The contract's text seemed to writhe when Henry wasn't looking directly at it, words rearranging themselves like living things. But certain phrases stood out with crystal clarity: immediate bestseller status, critical acclaim, literary immortality, eternal recognition. Duration of the agreement, Henry read aloud, his voice sounding foreign in his own ears. It says, perpetual. Standard industry language, job security in an uncertain market. The pen felt alive in Henry's grip, pulsing with its own heartbeat. All we require is one novel, your magnum opus. I guarantee you'll find the inspiration comes quite naturally once you commit. Henry's hand hovered over the signature line. The ink in the pen seemed to move of its own accord, eager to flow, to bind, to seal whatever bargain was being offered. In the amber depths of his whiskey, he could swear he saw faces, other writers perhaps, their mouths open, in what might have been screams or might have been the ecstasy of artistic creation. This is insane, he whispered, but his hand was already moving, forming letters with strokes that felt both completely voluntary and utterly inevitable. The moment Henry's signature was complete, reality took a step sideways and forgot to step back. The warm amber lighting of the brass monkey flickered and died, replaced by harsh fluorescence that cast everything in the sickly green of a morgue. The gentle murmur of other patrons faded to silence, then to something worse, the kind of absolute quiet that suggested they were no longer in a place where human voices were possible. Dorian's face began its true unveiling, features sharpening beyond human parameters, smile stretching to accommodate too many teeth arranged in too many rows. His eyes deepened from brown to black to something that hurt to perceive directly. Not darkness, but the absence of light, as if someone had carved holes in reality and forgotten to fill them back in. Congratulations, Henry. His voice had gained harmonics that made the empty whiskey bottles sing like a funeral choir. Welcome to Pinnacle Literary. I think you're going to find your new working conditions very stimulating. A door materialized where the restrooms had been. Not carved or built, but born from the wall like a geometric cancer. Black stone covered in symbols that crawled across its surface with arthropod persistence. It swung open without sound, revealing stairs that descended at angles that shouldn't exist in three-dimensional space. Shall we tour your new office? Dorian asked with the courtesy of a funeral director, discussing casket options. Henry tried to run, tried to scream, tried to do anything except stand and follow, but his body belonged to Pinnacle Literary Associates now, and Pinnacle Literary Associates had very specific ideas about employee mobility. Don't concern yourself with packing, Dorian said conversationally, as they descended steps that felt solid but cast no shadows. Everything you need for your masterpiece has been provided. Paper, pens, inspiration, all sourced from the finest materials. Previous clients have found the work environment exceptionally motivating. The staircase seemed to spiral down for miles, its walls lined with what Henry had initially mistaken for decorative engravings. Now he could see they were words. Thousands upon thousands of words carved directly into the living stone, each letter formed from what looked suspiciously like crystallized screams. Is this? Henry began. Your novel, every word of it. Dorian's laugh echoed with the resonance of breaking glass and dying hope. We find our authors work much more efficiently when they can see the finished product. You wanted literary immortality, Henry. Congratulations, your story will be read for all eternity. Every moment of exquisite agony, every plea for mercy that transforms into perfect prose, every scream that becomes a sentence more beautiful than anything Hemingway ever dreamed. The door sealed behind them with the finality of a tomb, and somewhere in the darkness ahead, Henry could hear the sound of typing. Hundreds of typewriters operated by fingers that never tired, creating literature that no living person would ever be allowed to read. But it would be beautiful. Oh God, it would be so beautiful. Dorian's penthouse office occupied the top 3 floors of a building that existed in the spaces between other buildings, accessible only by elevators that required no buttons, because they knew exactly where their passengers needed to go. Here, suspended between earth and sky, in a structure that cast no shadow and appeared on no city map, the city's most successful acquisitions agent allowed his professional mask to dissolve. The transformation was gradual, like watching a time-lapse film of decay running in reverse. His carefully human features elongated and sharpened into something that belonged in the marginalia of forbidden manuscripts. His warm brown eyes deepened to black, then to something beyond black. A darkness so complete it seemed to pull light from the surrounding air. His smile, so reassuring in boardrooms and taverns, stretched into something that would have driven medieval artists to madness trying to capture it. The office itself reflected his true nature with uncomfortable honesty. Mahogany bookshelves lined the walls, but the volumes they contained were bound in materials that had never belonged to any earthly creature. The air carried scents that had no names in human languages. Sulfur and ozone and something else. Something that smelled like the moment before a prayer is answered or denied. From his desk drawer, carved from a single piece of what might have been petrified midnight, Dorian withdrew his ledger. The book was massive, easily 3 feet tall and 2 feet wide, bound in leather that shifted colour depending on the angle of observation. Sometimes it appeared black as pitch, sometimes deep crimson, sometimes a shade of brown that suggested it had once been something else entirely. The cover bore no title, no publisher's mark, only a silver clasp, shaped like a human face frozen in the moment between ecstasy and agony. He opened the ledger with the reverence of a priest handling the most sacred relic, because in its way, that's exactly what it was. Each page contained dozens of signatures, each name glowing with its own distinct light. Fresh acquisitions, burned bright red, pulsing with the shock and rage of new understanding. Older entries had faded through orange to yellow to the pale blue of acceptance. The oldest signatures, from his early centuries in the business, glowed with the faint silver of names carved on tombstones, dim but eternal. Marcus Henderson's signature pulsed near the bottom of the current page like a fresh wound, accompanied by Janet Walsh and Theodore Blackwood. Their names writhed slightly, as if trying to escape the binding, but 3 centuries of contract law held them fast. Henry Calder's signature was still smoking, the ink so fresh it seemed liquid. As Dorian watched, tiny whispers rose from the letters, fragments of the novel Henry was already composing in his new workspace, each word carved from his own transformed suffering into something approaching art. But as Dorian turned through the older pages, reviewing centuries of successful acquisitions, one entry caught his attention like a broken tooth catching a tongue. Adeline Graves, March 15th, 1987. The signature was fading, its once bright glow reduced to the flicker of a candle in a hurricane. As he watched, it grew even dimmer, the letters becoming translucent like smoke dissipating in a breeze. This was impossible. The contracts were absolute, eternal, unbreakable. No soul had ever escaped the ledger once their name was properly inscribed. The binding was stronger than gravity, more fundamental than mathematics. Dorian felt something he hadn't experienced in over 300 years, of flawless professional service, the cold touch of genuine uncertainty. He reached for the phone on his desk, an antique rotary model that connected to only one number, regardless of what digits were dialed. The receiver felt warm against his ear, and when the voice answered, it carried the sound of tectonic plates shifting and stars burning out. "Sir," Dorian said, his voice carefully modulated to convey competence, despite the growing concern. "We appear to have a situation requiring immediate attention." The silence that followed lasted exactly 13 seconds, long enough for continents to drift measurable distances, for light to travel from the moon to Earth, for a human heart to beat 17 times in growing terror. "Elaborate." "Adeline Graves' 1987 acquisition. The signature is deteriorating." This time the silence lasted longer. In the background, Dorian could hear sounds that had no earthly equivalent. The whisper of wings that could eclipse suns. The grinding of cosmic gears that turned the universe toward its inevitable conclusion. The distant echo of a war that had been raging since before humans learned to fear the dark. "Find her," the voice finally commanded, each word carrying the weight of collapsing galaxies. "Bring her home, tonight. No delays, no excuses, no failures." The line went dead, leaving Dorian alone with his ledger and the growing certainty that his perfect professional record was about to face its first and possibly final test. He closed the book with hands that trembled almost imperceptibly, straightened his tie with movements that were perhaps a fraction less precise than usual, and prepared for what might be the most challenging client recovery of his very long career. After all, there was a first time for everything, even failure. Willow Creek Road meandered through countryside that real estate brochures called pastoral, and locals referred to as the ass end of nowhere. The asphalt gave way to gravel after the first mile, and by the time Dorian reached the end of the drive, civilization felt like something he'd read about in a book written by someone with an active imagination. The house squatted at the road's terminus like a challenge to the encroaching wilderness. White clappered siding that gleamed despite the lack of streetlights, green shutters that hung straight despite decades of weather, and a garden that seemed to grow in patterns that hurt to contemplate too closely. But it wasn't the house that made Dorian's carefully maintained human form itch with discomfort. It was the defences. Salt lines had been laid with mathematical precision, forming geometric patterns that predated Christianity by millennia and would probably outlast it by twice as long. Iron had been buried in the soil according to arrangements that made his teeth ache and his shadow try to crawl away from his body. And there was something else, something that made the air itself feel thick and resistant, as if reality had been reinforced with substances that shouldn't exist. He parked his car, a black sedan that somehow never appeared in photographs or security footage, at the bottom of the quarter-mile drive, and walked the distance on foot. His polished Oxford shoes made no sound on the gravel, but each step left small scorch marks in the stones that faded after he passed, as if the earth itself was trying to forget he'd been there. The woman who answered his knock was exactly as he remembered her. Aged 37 years in fast forward, but unmistakably the same person who'd signed her name in his ledger on a rainy Tuesday in March. Silver hair where once there had been chestnut brown. Laugh lines around eyes that had seen too much, but the same sharp intelligence that had first caught his attention outside a coffee shop in Manhattan's Upper West Side. She wore a simple blue dress and a cross that seemed to catch and hold light from sources that weren't visible to normal human perception. "Hello, Dorian," she said, as if he were an old friend stopping by for afternoon tea, rather than a supernatural entity come to collect on a 3-decade-old debt. "I was wondering when you'd finally make the trip." "Adeline." He touched the brim of a hat he wasn't wearing, a gesture of old-world courtesy that felt both natural and absurd given the circumstances. "You look well. The years have been remarkably kind to you." "Kind enough." She leaned against the doorframe with the casual confidence of someone holding a royal flush in a poker game, where everyone else was bluffing. "I assume you're here about our little contractual disagreement. You know precisely why I'm here." Dorian's professional smile felt increasingly strained, like a mask that no longer quite fit his face. "The ledger shows certain irregularities regarding our arrangement." "Does it?" Her voice carried a hint of amusement that made every bone in Dorian's borrowed body ache with wrongness. How terribly irregular. "The contract is binding, Adeline, eternal and absolute. You can't simply annul damnation because you've developed religious sensibilities in your twilight years." "Can't I?" She stepped aside from the doorway, gesturing into her house with mock hospitality that somehow conveyed both invitation and warning. "Why don't you come in? We can discuss the matter like civilized people." Dorian moved toward the threshold and encountered resistance that felt like trying to walk through liquid concrete while wearing lead boots. Every instinct he possessed, instincts honed over 3 centuries of successful collections, screamed at him to retreat, to find another approach, to abandon this particular acquisition entirely and report it as a loss. But the voice on the phone had been unambiguous in its expectations. Tonight, no exceptions, no failures. Having difficulty, Adeline's tone was solicitous, but her eyes glittered with something that might have been satisfaction, or might have been pity. "Perhaps you should try asking permission. I hear that's the polite thing to do when visiting someone's home." The words stuck in Dorian's throat like broken glass. In 300 years of professional service, he had never asked permission for anything. He took what he needed when he needed it, from people who had already agreed to give him everything they possessed and everything they would ever possess. "I don't ask permission," he said, his voice carrying undertones that made the windows rattle in their frames. "Then I suppose you'll be conducting this conversation from my porch." Adeline settled into a rocking chair that definitely hadn't been there moments before. "I have all night. Do you?" They stared at each other across the threshold that separated the mundane world from whatever sanctuary Adeline had constructed around herself. Finally, with the taste of sulphur and burning pride scorching his tongue, Dorian forced out the words, "May I come in?" "No." The words struck him like a physical blow. He actually staggered backward, his carefully maintained human facade flickering like a dying light bulb. For just a moment, his true form was visible. Something tall and angular and fundamentally wrong, with too many joints and eyes that burned like dying stars, and a smile that suggested the universe was one vast practical joke, with humanity as the punchline. "You signed a contract," he snarled, his voice carrying harmonics that shattered 3 windows in the house next door. If there had been a house next door, which there wasn't because houses tended to avoid neighborhoods where Adeline Graves had taken up residence. "Your soul belongs to my employer. I'm here to collect what is legally and lawfully owed." "Belonged," Adeline corrected, her voice maintaining the same conversational tone she might use to discuss the weather or the price of groceries. Past tense, 37 years, 4 months, and 16 days ago, I discovered something interesting in the fine print of our agreement. The contracts are perfect, ironclad. I wrote them myself based on templates that predate human civilization. "Did you..." Adeline reached into her dress pocket and withdrew a folded piece of parchment that made Dorian's vision blur, and his teeth itch just to look at. "When was the last time you actually read one of your contracts, word for word, comma for comma, every subsection and addendum and piece of microscopic fine print that your employers were kind enough to include?" Dorian's silver watch began ticking backward, its hands moving with increasing urgency as if trying to run away from what was about to be revealed. "I don't have time for games, old woman." "This isn't a game, Dorian. This is education." Adeline unfolded the parchment, and even at a distance, Dorian could see that entire sections had been burned away, leaving gaps in the text like missing pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. Subsection 47, paragraph 12, addendum C, subclause 6. Would you like me to read it to you, or would you prefer to continue assuming that contracts written by your employers contain no escape clauses whatsoever? "The contracts are absolute," Dorian repeated, but his voice lacked its usual conviction. Something cold and unfamiliar was growing in what passed for his chest, a sensation that might have been doubt, if doubt were a physical thing that fed on certainty and excreted terror. "The contracted party may void this agreement through acts of genuine sacrifice undertaken in service of divine mercy," Adeline read, her voice carrying clearly across the space that separated them, "provided said acts result in the preservation of innocent life and are undertaken with full knowledge of the personal cost, and further provided that the contractor knowingly and willingly chooses potential damnation in place of assured salvation for another soul." The memory struck Dorian like lightning, illuminating a landscape he'd never wanted to see clearly. March 15th, 1987, 3:47 p.m. Sarah Mitchell, 19 years old, drunk on stolen wine and driving a car she'd taken from her boyfriend after their fight about commitment and the future, and all the things 19-year-olds fight about when they think they have forever to figure it out. The intersection of Maple and 3rd, where a school bus made its daily stop at 3:50 p.m. to collect 32 children from Riverside Elementary. Sarah's stolen car accelerating through a red light at 60 miles per hour toward a collision that would have left those 32 children as nothing more than statistics and trauma and tiny coffins. And Adeline Graves, who had signed her contract only 6 months earlier, standing on the corner waiting for the light to change. The moment of realization crossing her face as she understood what was about to happen and what she could do to prevent it. The way she'd thrown herself not away from the oncoming car but directly into its path, triggering the crash 3 seconds early, taking the full impact herself while 32 children watched in horror from behind reinforced glass. She'd died for exactly 47 seconds, long enough for the paramedics to pronounce her deceased, long enough for her soul to begin its journey towards collection. But then, something impossible had happened. She'd taken a breath, opened her eyes, and sat up on the stretcher, while the paramedics stared in shock, and the accident report became a medical miracle that no one could quite explain. "You planned it," Dorian whispered, the words torn from his throat by a kind of revelation he'd never wanted to experience. "From the moment I signed your paper." Adeline's smile was radiant, with a joy that made Dorian's true form recoil like a vampire from sunlight. "It took me 4 months of research in books that most people are wise enough never to open, but I found what I was looking for. Your employers aren't the only ones capable of writing binding contracts, you know. They just happen to be very good at hiding their escape clauses in places where desperate people wouldn't think to look." Dorian's human mask was failing badly now. His features had sharpened into something that belonged in the nightmares of medieval mystics, his smile stretching beyond the boundaries of facial anatomy, his eyes becoming holes in reality that led to places where light went to die. "The sacrifice voided your contract," he said, his voice carrying frequencies that made dogs howl 3 towns over, "but you didn't remain dead. That makes you a walking violation of natural law, an error in the cosmic bookkeeping that requires correction." "Does it?" Adeline stood and moved deeper into her house, putting additional distance between herself and the thing that wore Dorian's face like an ill-fitting suit. "And what happens to you, I wonder, when you return to your employer empty-handed? What's the penalty for a perfect record that suddenly isn't perfect anymore?" For the first time in his very long existence, Dorian experienced something that could only be called terror. His phone rang, not with the mundane electronic tone of modern technology, but with the sound of breaking bells and screaming metal and something else, something that sounded like the universe clearing its throat before delivering very bad news. He answered without taking his eyes off Adeline, though looking at her was becoming increasingly difficult as his vision shifted into spectra that human optics were never designed to process. Slate. The voice that responded spoke only 2 words, but they carried enough malice to poison entire galaxies. Time's up. The call ended with the finality of a coffin lid closing. Dorian looked at his watch and saw the hands spinning wildly now, decades blurring past in reverse, counting down to a deadline that would redefine his understanding of consequences. He doesn't much like imperfection, Adeline observed, her voice carrying across the growing distance between them, rather particular about his collection being complete and properly catalogued. Perfectionist, you might say. You don't understand, Dorian said, his voice fracturing into harmonics that made reality itself seem unstable. I cannot return without you. Not after this long, not with this particular case. He'll what? Decide that a tool that can't complete its function is no longer useful? Add you to his permanent collection instead of keeping you on as an independent contractor? Adeline's expression softened slightly, though she continued backing away from the threshold. You know, Dorian, that escape clause I found, it never specifies that the person using it has to be human. Dorian stared at her, his inhuman mind racing through possibilities, calculations, potential outcomes that branched like cracks in breaking glass. What are you saying? I'm saying that choice is the most powerful force in any universe, even for creatures like you, especially for creatures like you. She gestured to the cross around her neck, which was glowing now with light that seemed to come from somewhere beyond the visible spectrum. Redemption doesn't discriminate based on species, Dorian, only on willingness. Behind Dorian, the air began to crack and blister like paint peeling from a wall exposed to unimaginable heat. The temperature was dropping rapidly, but the smell in the air was of burning, not fire, but the scent of reality itself being consumed by something too vast and terrible to exist in normal space. Choose quickly, Adeline whispered, retreating to the back of her house. I don't think either of us has much time left. Dorian turned to face the approaching presence and felt his professional composure shatter like glass struck by a sledgehammer. The thing that was manifesting in the space behind him wasn't just his employer. It was the original template from which every nightmare humanity had ever experienced had been carved, something so fundamentally antithetical to existence that space itself seemed to recoil from its presence, reality bending and warping, like heated metal, around the edges of its arrival. The contracts, Dorian whispered. The words pulled from somewhere deeper than his throat, deeper than his borrowed human form, from whatever remained of what he might once have been before centuries of faithful service had worn away everything except efficiency and hunger. All those people, thousands of them, Marcus, Janet, Theodore, Henry, all of them suffering because of me. Yes, Adeline said, and there was no judgment in her voice, only acknowledgement of a truth they both understood. He couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't voice the possibility that was forming in his mind like dawn, breaking over a landscape he'd never allowed himself to see. The possibility that 3 centuries of perfect service might be nothing more than an elaborate form of slavery, that he might have been a victim long before he'd ever become a perpetrator. If you chose to sacrifice yourself instead of completing this collection, yes, the binding would break. Not just mine, all of them. Every signature in your ledger would burn away like morning mist. She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice carried the kind of gentleness usually reserved for frightened children or dying animals. It wouldn't be easy, Dorian, and it wouldn't be quick, but it would end their suffering. All of it. The presence behind Dorian was taking shape now, reality stretching and tearing to accommodate something that had no business existing in a universe governed by physics and sanity. He could feel its attention focusing on him like a magnifying glass concentrating sunlight, and he knew with absolute certainty that his 3 centuries of flawless service would count for nothing against his failure to deliver this one soul. There would be consequences. There were always consequences. "Why?" he asked, his voice barely audible over the sound of existence itself groaning under the weight of his employer's manifestation. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because everyone deserves a choice," Adeline said, and her words carried across the growing chasm between them like a lifeline thrown to a drowning man. "Everyone, even you, especially you." The presence spoke then, its voice carrying the authority of cosmic law and the patience of geological time. "Bring me the woman." Dorian opened his briefcase one final time, hands that had signed 10,000 documents and shaken, 10,000 hands now trembling like leaves in a hurricane. His ledger lay open to the current page, all those names glowing like captured stars, all those lives transformed from hope to torment by his professional excellence. Marcus Henderson, whose signature still pulsed with the shock of understanding what his salvation had truly cost. Janet Walsh, whose precise handwriting seemed to whisper calculations that would never balance. Theodore Blackwood, whose lawyer's training was useless in a courtroom where the only law was suffering. Henry Calder, already deep in the composition of his masterpiece, each word carved from his own transformed agony into something approaching terrible beauty, and behind them page after page of names stretching back through centuries of acquisition. Farmers who traded their souls for good harvests, only to discover that the crops they grew fed only demons. Artists who bargained for inspiration, now creating works of such perfection that human eyes could not look upon them without going mad. Lovers who'd signed contracts for eternal devotion, bound together now in ways that made love indistinguishable from exquisite torture. All of them suffering, all of them damned, all of them his fault. "No," Dorian said. The word hung in the air like the last note of a symphony, resonating with frequencies that had no names in human mathematics. The presence behind him erupted in fury that shattered windows for miles in every direction, rage so pure and terrible that it momentarily stopped the rotation of the earth and made the sun flicker like a dying candle. But Dorian was already moving, turning to face his employer with his true form finally, completely revealed. Something that might once have been beautiful beyond human comprehension, now twisted by centuries of service into a perfect instrument of collection and damnation. And for the first time in his existence, he used that power not to bind souls, but to free them. The ledger erupted in flames that burned white instead of red, each page turning to ash that rose on winds that had no earthly source. Every signature flared as it was consumed, Marcus Henderson blazing like a star going supernova, Janet Walsh's precise writing dissolving into light that sang mathematical harmonies, Theodore Blackwood's scrawl becoming a brief constellation of justice, finally served. Henry Calder's smoking signature burst like a firework, each fragment a word of the novel he would now never have to write in blood and screams. Thousands of names, tens of thousands, all releasing from bondage in explosions of light visible from orbit. Farmers and artists and lovers and dreamers, all the desperate and damned, suddenly free to continue journeys that had been interrupted by cleverly worded contracts and professional smiles. Dorian's scream merged with something infinitely larger and more furious, as his employer's rage consumed them both. But even as his carefully maintained existence came apart at the subatomic level, even as centuries of collected power was turned inward like a sword drawn against its wielder, he felt something he had never experienced in all his long years of service. Peace. The last thing he saw before the light took him was Adeline's smile, radiant with the kind of joy that could redeem devils and make angels weep with relief. The last thing he heard was the sound of chains breaking, not just his own, but thousands upon thousands of others, a symphony of liberation that would echo across dimensions for eons to come. The last thing he felt was gratitude. Adeline found his silver watch on her porch the next morning, nestled in a small pile of ash that sparkled like diamond dust in the early sunlight. She picked up the timepiece carefully. It was warm to the touch, and for the first time in over 3 centuries, its hands were moving forward at exactly the right speed. 12 a.m. Midnight. The end of one day and the beginning of another. She carried the watch inside and placed it on her mantel between a framed photograph of 32 schoolchildren and a growing collection of letters that had been arriving all week. Thank you notes from people who had suddenly, inexplicably, found themselves free of obligations they couldn't quite remember taking on, released from contracts that had seemed so reasonable at the time of signing. Marcus Henderson had written to say that his company's financial crisis had resolved overnight, in ways that defied accounting logic but somehow felt more honest than any balance sheet he'd ever seen. Janet Walsh's note mentioned strange dreams of burning ledgers and numbers that finally added up to something good. Theodore Blackwood's letter was brief and written in his own handwriting for the first time in years. Just 3 words. I remember now. Henry Calder's postcard had arrived that morning, postmarked from a coffee shop in Vermont where he'd apparently fled to write what he described as the most important novel of my life, one that belongs to me alone. The image on the front was of a sunrise breaking over mountains, and his message was simple. Thank you for the second chance. I won't waste it. But there were others, hundreds of them, thousands of them. Letters in dozens of languages from people across the globe, all describing the same phenomenon. Burdens lifted, debts forgiven, contracts dissolved, souls returned to their rightful owners, with interest compounded by years of suffering transformed, through some cosmic alchemy, into wisdom. Adeline made herself a cup of tea and sat by a window watching the sun rise over a world where certain contracts would never again be signed, where certain choices would never again be forced upon the desperate and the afraid. The mailman would arrive soon with more letters, more stories of liberation, more evidence that redemption was always possible for those brave enough to choose it, even for devils who remembered, at the last possible moment, what they had been before they became what they were told they had to be. The silver watch on her mantel ticked steadily forward, marking time in a universe where free will was more than just a philosophical concept, where every ending contained the seeds of a new beginning, and where sometimes, just sometimes, the good guys won, not because they were stronger or smarter or more powerful, but because they were willing to sacrifice everything for the chance to make things right. Outside her window, the morning light caught the edge of something metallic half buried in her garden. She would investigate later, but she already knew what she would find. The charred remains of a briefcase that had once contained the fates of countless souls, now empty, except for the lingering scent of freedom and the faintest echo of a devil's final choice. The watch ticked on, counting moments in a world made new, and somewhere in the sound of its steady rhythm, Adeline could swear she heard something that might have been laughter, not the bitter amusement of the damned, but the joyous sound of someone who had finally, after centuries of slavery, learned how to be free. 6 months later, the letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, addressed in handwriting that seemed to shift and change when Adeline wasn't looking directly at it. The envelope bore no postmark, no return address, only her name written in ink that gleamed like liquid starlight. Inside, a single sheet of paper covered in elegant script. Dear Adeline, I hope this letter finds you well. I wanted to thank you for showing me that even creatures like me could choose differently. The transition has been interesting. Painful, yes, but instructive in ways I never expected. I've been given a new position. Call it rehabilitation through service. I help souls who found themselves bound by contracts they don't remember signing. It turns out there are quite a few of my former colleagues still operating, and business is unfortunately booming. But here's the curious thing. Every soul I help free remembers your garden, your tea, your kindness to a monster who didn't deserve it. You've become something of a legend in circles where legends are usually made of screaming and fire. I wanted you to know the children you saved that day in 1987. They've all grown up to save others in turn. Teachers, doctors, social workers, parents who raise their children with unusual kindness. Goodness, it seems, compounds over time, just as surely as evil. Thank you for reminding me that choice is the most powerful force in any universe. With gratitude beyond words, a friend. P.S. Keep the watch. Time moves differently for those of us who've learned to count our moments in redemptions rather than acquisitions. Adeline smiled and carefully folded the letter, placing it in the wooden box where she kept all the correspondence from souls who'd found their way back to themselves. The box was getting quite full. Outside her window, the morning light caught the face of the silver watch on her mantle, its hands moving steadily forward into whatever came next. And in that light, for just a moment, she could swear she saw a reflection that wasn't quite her own, the face of a man in a perfectly tailored suit, smiling with genuine warmth for the first time in centuries. Then the moment passed, but the warmth remained. Somewhere in the distance, bells were ringing, not in sorrow or warning, but in celebration. The sound of second chances being granted, of debts being forgiven, of souls being returned to their rightful owners. The sound of the universe keeping its books balanced, not through suffering, but through joy. And time moved on, forward and only forward, carrying them all towards whatever redemption might be waiting just around the corner.